I'm Tony Jaa from Thailand and play Decha. This is really important for me. I can inspire from the Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee and Jet Li.
There was a time when Tony Jaa looked unstoppable. He appeared out of Thailand with a fighting style so explosive that audiences couldn't believe what they were seeing. He jumped over people. He smashed through opponents with knees and elbows. He performed stunts that looked too dangerous to attempt, let alone perform repeatedly for a movie. And unlike many action stars, Tony Jaa didn't need Hollywood technology to make himself look superhuman. His body was the special effect. When Ong-Bak, Muay Thai Warrior arrived, Tony wasn't just introduced as another martial arts actor. He was introduced as a phenomenon. Suddenly, fans were talking about him in the same breath as Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, and Jet Li. Hollywood seemed inevitable. It looked like Tony Jaa's career could only go higher. But instead, one of the most promising martial arts careers of his generation took a completely unexpected turn. Tony disappeared. His productions became troubled. His relationship with people around him deteriorated. Contract disputes restricted his career. And eventually, at a moment when most actors would have been desperate to become even more famous, Tony Jaa walked away from the movie business and entered a Buddhist monastery. So what happened? How did the man who seemed destined to become a worldwide action superstar lose the momentum that made him famous? To understand that, we have to go back to where his story began. A boy with an unusual dream. Tony Jaa was born Tachakorn Yiram in Surin, Thailand. His childhood was far removed from the glamorous world of international cinema. His parents were rice farmers, and Tony grew up surrounded by the traditions and hard work of rural Thailand. But even as a child, he was fascinated by something completely different. Martial arts movies. He watched stars such as Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, and Jet Li and became obsessed with their movements. But Tony wasn't satisfied with simply watching them. He wanted to understand how they moved. He practiced their techniques himself, repeating kicks, punches, jumps, and acrobatic movements again and again. Eventually, that childhood fascination became serious training. At around 10 years old, Tony began learning Muay Thai at a local temple. He didn't have the kind of professional facilities that future movie stars normally have access to. What he did have was discipline. And he had an almost extraordinary willingness to keep practicing. As Tony became older, he competed in local Muay Thai matches and continued expanding his abilities. But becoming a professional fighter wasn't his ultimate goal. He wanted to combine martial arts with movies. That dream eventually brought him to one of the most important people in his life. Punna Rittikrai. The mentor who changed his life. Punna Rittikrai was a martial artist, stuntman, choreographer, and filmmaker who understood the potential Tony possessed. Tony wasn't famous yet. He wasn't even a major actor. But Punna recognized that Tony had something unusual. He had incredible physical control. He was fearless. And he was willing to do things most performers would refuse to attempt. Punna invited Tony to join his stunt team. For the next several years, Tony worked largely away from the spotlight. He spent approximately 14 years as a stuntman. Think about that. While audiences were watching other actors become stars, Tony was doing the dangerous work behind the scenes. He performed difficult stunts. He doubled for other performers. He learned how action scenes were constructed. He even performed stunts involving elephants. But those years weren't wasted. They became Tony's real education. He wasn't just learning martial arts. He was learning filmmaking. Under Punna's guidance, Tony studied different disciplines and learned how to translate real fighting techniques into something that could work on camera. And that combination would eventually make him different from almost everyone else. Tony's action didn't look weightless. It looked painful. His strikes looked like they actually hurt. His jumps looked dangerous because they were dangerous. And his physical performances didn't depend heavily on wires or digital effects. After years of waiting, Tony finally got his opportunity. And then the world noticed him. Ong-Bak changes everything. In 2003, Ong-Bak, Muay Thai Warrior arrived. For Tony Jaa, this wasn't simply another movie. It was the beginning of an entirely new life. International audiences were stunned by what they saw. Tony moved with incredible speed, but there was also a rawness to his fighting. His Muay Thai techniques gave the action a brutal quality. His knees and elbows became weapons. His acrobatics seemed almost impossible. And the physical commitment behind the movie made him immediately stand out. The film turned Tony from an unknown stuntman into an international martial arts star. Then came Tom-Yum-Goong, released internationally as The Protector, in 2005. If Ong-Bak had introduced Tony to the world, this movie demonstrated just how far his physical abilities could go. The famous continuous fight sequence became one of his signature moments. Tony moves through the location while fighting multiple opponents, creating the impression that the entire sequence is unfolding in one relentless burst. For martial arts fans, it was unforgettable. Tony Jaa wasn't simply another action actor. He was becoming a benchmark. People began asking whether Thailand had produced the next great martial arts superstar. Comparisons to Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, and Jet Li became increasingly common. And Hollywood noticed. There were major opportunities on the horizon. Jackie Chan reportedly wanted Tony involved with Rush Hour 3. That could have been a huge step toward American stardom. But Tony was already deeply involved with Ong-Bak too. The scheduling conflict meant the opportunity passed him by. And unfortunately, Ong-Bak 2 would become far more complicated than anyone expected. The beginning of the collapse. Tony's career looked perfect from the outside. Behind the scenes, however, things were becoming increasingly difficult. His relationship with his mentor, Punna Ridikrai, became strained. Creative disagreements created tension, and the partnership that had helped Tony reach the top was no longer as stable as it had once been. A planned project known as Sword was eventually cancelled. At the same time, Tony was dealing with another major problem. His contract with Sahom Film. The studio had been an important part of his rise, but the agreement placed significant restrictions on Tony's professional freedom. Even after becoming an internationally recognized martial artist, he couldn't simply accept every opportunity that came his way. That became especially frustrating as international filmmakers began showing interest in him. Tony's biggest problem, however, was about to become Ong-Bak 2. He wasn't just starring in it. He was also taking on directing responsibilities. The pressure became enormous. The production experienced serious difficulties, and Tony was reportedly becoming increasingly exhausted. Then something happened that shocked everyone. Tony disappeared from the production. For weeks, he wasn't around. Rumors immediately began circulating. Some people thought he had suffered a mental breakdown. Others believed the pressure had simply become too much. But rather than continuing to fight through the chaos, Tony made a decision that few people expected. He stepped away. He entered a Buddhist monastery. From action star to monk. Imagine the contrast. Only a few years earlier, Tony Jaa had been flying through movie screens, destroying opponents with spectacular Muay Thai techniques. Now he was living in a monastery. The noise of movie sets had been replaced by meditation and prayer. The constant pressure of fame had been replaced by a much simpler routine. For Tony, this appeared to be a period of reflection and spiritual renewal. And becoming a monk wasn't necessarily as unusual in Thailand as it might appear to international audiences. Temporary Buddhist ordination is a familiar cultural tradition. But the timing made Tony's decision particularly striking. His career was at a critical point. And while he was away, the action movie industry continued changing. New stars appeared. New styles became popular. Hollywood moved on. When Tony eventually returned, the world was still interested in him, but the moment had changed. The Tony Jaa who had seemed destined to dominate martial arts cinema was no longer standing at the exact center of the conversation. And that was going to make his next challenge even harder. Hollywood doesn't go as planned. Eventually, Tony returned to acting. And Hollywood was still interested. His work in Ong-Bak and Tom-Yum-Goong had already given him international recognition. In 2015, he appeared in Fast Furious 7. On paper, this looked like the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. Tony was now part of one of the biggest action franchises in the world. He appeared alongside stars including Vin Diesel and Paul Walker. But there was a problem. Tony wasn't the main attraction. His role was relatively small. Fans did get to see him fight, but the movie never gave him enough room to display the full range of what had made him famous. Then came XXX, Return of Xander Cage in 2017. Once again, Tony joined a major international action cast. Once again, fans hoped this could be the movie that finally established him as a major Hollywood star. And once again, it didn't happen. Hollywood had placed Tony Jaa inside major movies. But it hadn't given him the kind of role that made audiences say, "This is Tony Jaa's movie." That distinction mattered. Because Tony's greatest strength had always been his physical performance. And Hollywood wasn't necessarily interested in building an entire franchise around that style. The career he never got. There was also another challenge. Tony had become famous primarily through physical storytelling. But American movies often demanded more dialogue, personality, humor, and character development. Tony's English was improving, but the language barrier still made certain roles more difficult. He wasn't naturally positioned as the fast-talking Hollywood hero. And unlike Jackie Chan, who developed a comedic identity that translated extremely well to American audiences, Tony didn't have an equally established Hollywood persona. Unlike Jet Li, whose quiet intensity became part of his appeal, Tony was often defined primarily by his fighting ability. That created a strange situation. Everyone knew Tony Jaa could fight. Almost everyone who had seen Ong-Bak knew he was extraordinary. But Hollywood never quite figured out how to turn that physical talent into a long-term leading man career. And by then, the years of contract disputes and career interruptions had already cost him valuable momentum. Tony eventually continued appearing in international productions. But the enormous explosion created by Ong-Bak was difficult to recreate. And that's where the sadness of Tony Jaa's story really comes from. What if? What if Tony had never faced those contract problems? What if Rush Hour 3 had happened? What if Ong-Bak 2 had been completed without the turmoil? What if Tony had entered Hollywood while his international popularity was at its absolute peak? Could he have become the next Jackie Chan? Could he have built a franchise around his own character? Could he have become one of the defining action stars of his generation? Nobody can answer those questions. But the possibilities are fascinating. Tony had the physical talent. He had the international audience. He had already proven that he could carry action sequences that audiences remembered for years. What he didn't have was the uninterrupted opportunity to turn all of that into a lasting Hollywood empire. But Tony Jaa didn't really lose. It's easy to look at Tony's career and call it a failure. But that would be unfair. He achieved something extraordinary. A boy from rural Thailand became an internationally recognized martial arts star. A stuntman who spent years working in the shadows became the face of one of the most influential martial arts films of the modern era. He helped introduce audiences around the world to a raw style of Muay Thai action. And even years after Ong-Bak, people still talk about those fights. That's a legacy. Maybe Tony Jaa didn't become the next Bruce Lee. Maybe Hollywood never gave him the leading roles fans wanted. Maybe his career took a completely different path from the one everyone imagined in 2003. But perhaps the most important thing is this. Tony Jaa's story isn't really about a man who failed to become a superstar. It's about a superstar who briefly stepped away from the world that had consumed him. The fame came. The pressure came. The contracts came. The conflicts came. And eventually, Tony chose to step back. For a man who spent his career pushing his body to its absolute limits, perhaps the greatest thing he ever did was finally stop. Today, his name remains attached to some of the most impressive martial arts action ever captured on film. And whenever someone watches Ong-Bak for the first time and asks, how did he do that? They're discovering exactly why Tony Jaa became a legend in the first place. His career may not have reached the heights many predicted, but the impact he made during those few explosive years can never be taken away. Tony Jaa didn't become the next Bruce Lee. He became Tony Jaa. And maybe that's a legacy worth remembering. So what do you think? Did Tony Jaa deserve a much bigger career in Hollywood? Or was his decision to step away from fame ultimately the right one? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories and behind-the-scenes journeys from the biggest names in action cinema.